Welcome, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome to you all, to extend a very warm welcome to you all to this In Conversation event with David Olusoga, Professor of Public History at the University of Manchester, where we discuss the writing of history today in the context of the recent Black Lives Matter movement, but more generally for the need to revisit the discipline in the light of the imminent and urgent demands to decolonize the curriculum that have been expressed across the world so powerfully, starting with the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in Cape Town. David is a well-known face on our screens and has been engaged in making award-winning documentaries as well as presenting on Black British history over the last 15 years or so, including his very well-informed and gripping series, A House Through Time, which had me hooked onto the screen, and the BAFTA award-winning Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners. His most recent TV series, Black and British, A Forgotten History, is a powerful narrative of the travails and triumphs of Black British people in this country, which highlights simultaneously the many occasions on which they were let down by the state. David is also the author of books including Black and British, A Forgotten History, which was published by Macmillan in 2016, and The World's War, which was published by Head of Zeus in 2015. In 2019, David was appointed as Professor of Public History at Manchester and gave us his inaugural lecture on identity, Britishness, and the Windrush. So thank you to you, David. We also have with us two students from Manchester, Hannah Ward, who is acting as co-host with me today for this event, and Xavier Banson, who's our curator today, who will be collecting the questions that you have sent in already, and he will be presenting those questions to David. So Hannah and Xavier, can I ask you to please introduce yourselves, starting with Hannah?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm Hannah Ward. I'm currently a history master's student at the University of Manchester. I came here for my undergrad, and I guess the reason I'm involved with this event today is because I'm also the founding co-editor of a magazine called In Colour, which is basically a space for creators of colour to come along, and we empower and amplify them and showcase their talents as well. Yeah, so glad to be here.
Xavier.
I'm Xavier, and I also am or was a master's history student with Hannah, and I guess I'm here because as part of my course, I was a part of the introduction to documentary filmmaking module, which David actually taught on, and have an interest in making documentaries myself.
Thank you. And I am Anindita Ghosh, Professor of Modern Indian History at the History Department at Manchester. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you on this event, David, and thank you for being with us today. So if I may kick off with a few questions. So the first thing I wanted to really ask you is, what is this nature of overlap that we have between public history and academic history writing? And you've been doing really valuable work for some time now, on the interstices of this public and academic history front. And you have reached out to more hearts and minds with really important messages than us academic historians have, barely, maybe a fraction of the people who watch you on screen read our books. And yet in your work, you draw on the scholarship of academic historians. And in that sense, academic and public historians live in a kind of symbiotic relationship, don't they? They're constantly feeding off each other. So my question to you is, where do you see these overlaps as most productive? And how can we sustain this relationship? And how can we help each other to build a better and fairer understanding of our subject and wider society?
Thank you. And it's lovely to be virtually in Manchester. This overlap is increasing, and I think the ultimate fuel to make this overlap work is the thing which I think used to be lacking in the area that I'm most interested in, which is television. When I was first a television producer, there was a powerful idea that we were at war with the facts, that consultants and contributors to programs needed to be made to say things that we wanted to say, that we needed to mold history, and that the rest of the world, especially historians, especially anybody who had the temerity to be an academic, just couldn't understand the world we were in. When I was developing one of the projects that I made, actually I'll name it, when I was developing Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners that went on to win a BAFTA, that was a partnership between the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project at University College London and the History Department of the BBC. And the two key figures at UCL are Catherine Hall and Nick Draper. Now, if you've ever met Catherine Hall and Nick Draper, they're not people that you take lightly. They are two of the most impressive people I've ever met. And I have a healthy respect and a tiny dash of fear of both of them. My colleagues, we wrote a proposal with them, and my colleagues decided to not send the proposal to Catherine because, quote, she wouldn't understand a TV proposal. And the idea that you would not send a 4-page document into the home of Catherine and Stuart Hall because they would have difficulties of interpretation is a level of disrespect and cultural ignorance that just shocked me. And that was the old attitude in television. What we do is so specialist and amazing that nobody else can understand it. That's nonsense. Even when we deal with people who deconstruct television academically for a living, we patronize them. That was the old culture in television. And what changed it was that was all predicated on the presumption that the audience just didn't like had to be spoon-fed lots of sugar with any sort of details and facts. And the thing that ended that, the thing that began a transformation that means the overlap is greater and the potential for even yet greater overlap exists, was Who Do You Think You Are? Who Do You Think You Are, which started as a sort of 1-series experiment on BBC Two and is now, I think, 15th series. One of the most successful formats of all time, invented by Alex Graham, who I have the pleasure of working with on the Scott Trust that runs The Guardian. What that did is it showed that we've been underestimating the audience, that the audience do care about the raw material of history, which is documents. All they need to be given is a reason to care. But when I was first a producer, the pejoratives put in, whenever we said document, somebody would use a pejorative adjective. They would call them dry, dusty, old, or boring. There was always a pejorative before documents. You would say we'd film in an archive and people would go, well, can't we copy the papers and take them out somewhere dramatic? And I'll go, but it's the real thing in the archive. You know, it's the real stuff, not a photocopy of it. And there is reasons for sometimes copying stuff, but there's also a reason for believing in the fabric, the materiality of history. Who do you think you are changed all of that? Because when you have been brought along on a journey by the emotional journey of a celebrity, whether you know them or not, whether you care about them or not, and they need to know what the document says, what the death certificate says, what the prisoner of war records say, whatever it is, what the workhouse records say, you enormously care. And you get a flash of that thing that is the reason people do history. Because when you're in the archives and you find the thing, you find the document or the signature that says what happened, and that you are transported into the life of somebody in the past. That's it's what Trevelyan called the quasi-miraculous fact of history. And I think the audiences get it. And we underestimated them for a long time. When I was first a history producer, there was an idea that we needed to make everything a drama documentary, because you couldn't just tell people about stuff. You had to show them. We had to get third rate because drama documentary is just cheap drama, because drama costs £1 million an hour, documentary costs £250,000 an hour. So a drama documentary might get £350,000 an hour, which means it's still a cheap drama. And it looks terrible. They're very hard to do because they're just cheap dramas. But that was the cult, the idea that you could take a presenter or take people into the archives, that you could use the materiality, the real fabric of history to tell stories. That was absolutely anathema to the attitudes of television. Then Who Do You Think You Are came along and everyone suddenly got it. And it took a long time. I mean, it is 7 years since we made started making Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners. And still that idea that the experts, the people who'd done this incredible archival work, couldn't understand our 4-page proposal was still there. The idea that we needed to have dramatic. Everything had to be about, scale. That was still there. The suggestion that maybe we should still get some actors involved was still there, and it's been blown out of the water now. When people say to me, but it'll just be documents, I go, well, I want a BAFTA, which was a series which is mainly me sat in the National Archives with documents. We underestimated the audience for a hell of a long time, and once the audience and television history and academic history can coalesce on the same ground, which is that this stuff is the real stuff of history, then the potential for overlap and the differences between us begin to sort of to not evaporate, but lessen. So I think it's very much down to a single program that proved that decades of presumptions about who the audience were, what they needed to care about history, and what mattered to them were absolutely erroneous.
Thank you very much, David. That really brings our readership stroke audience alive for us, isn't it? Because, both public historians and academic historians are in fact catering to the need for history today. This is what they want to hear. This is what they want to learn about. And that's what we write and make films about. That story about Catherine Hall and Stuart Hall and the 4-page proposal that never went to them is really an eye opener for me. And what the producer is really trying to do here, as we all can clearly see, is to really shape the program in their own way. It's not because of lack of understanding on the part of the Halls, but more, a kind of urge to zealously guard the frontiers of television, which, as you said, this one program just opened up for everyone. So, that's a brilliant insight into what the practice of our discipline can actually achieve for people across, all domains of work, whether it's discipline or filmmaking or whatever the case may be. So if I could move on to the next question, which nicely builds on what you have just said, and that is, again, continuing with the theme of public history, of course, is, the ways in which the nation understands its history in this country is changing so rapidly. So not just in television, but also in public spaces. And here, of course, my reference is to the recent controversy over memorials and statues in public spaces, following the removal of the Colston statue in your own town. And my question is, it's fueled very much by an understanding of what constitutes, therefore, Britain's past and Britain's history. And my question stems from a very powerful piece that you wrote on in The Guardian on the 8th of June this year, called "The Toppling of Edward Colston Statue is not an attack on history, it is history." And if I may, I'd like to quote some of the most powerful lines I have read in recent times in journalism over this event. And you say, "Today is the first full day since 1895 on which the effigy of a mass murderer does not cast its shadow over Bristol's city centre. Those who lament the dawning of this day and who are appalled by what happened on Sunday need to ask themselves some difficult questions. Do they honestly believe that Bristol was a better place yesterday because the figure of a slave trader stood at its center? Are they genuinely unable, even now, to understand why those descended from Colston's victims have always regarded this statue as an outrage and for decades pleaded for its removal?" And then you go on to say, "Whatever is said over the next few days, this was not an attack on history. This is history. It's one of those rare historic moments whose arrival means things can never go back to how they were." And, they're really powerful, moving lines, and echoed also by an academic historian, the esteemed Peter Mandler, amongst others, who said he was tired of reminding people that, in his words, history was being made as much by the putting up of that statue as in its removal. Very similar thoughts being echoed across, various in the writings of various historians and historical commentators at this time. And so my question to you is, And also, if before I forget, also there was this recent open letter, wasn't there, to the Home Office, where over 180 historians were signatories, including you and me, David, complaining precisely about this obfuscation in the life of in the UK test study book, and calling it misleading and demonstrably false. This is a phrase from that open letter. So this is a concern that is being raised across, several domains here. So what might be your approach then to reshaping the public understanding of slavery and empire in Britain today? What can we do as historians to persuade the establishment to shift its views in school education, in media representation, to various other fields? What can be done? I mean, you are doing really, really valuable and important work there, but what can be done? What can we do as a society to change that view?
I'm afraid my views are very dark here, because I think what is happening is these attempts to create a history that is honest about what our country is and what it's done and how it got here, that is being used and it's being weaponized against us brilliantly. I think we have a government that understands that the function of national historical myth is not to be true, it is to be politically useful. And that is what is being defended, and that's what's being, I think, amplified. When politicians say that to remove statues is rewriting history, they know that's not true. They're educated people. They went to very good universities. They're fully aware. Many of them studied history. They're fully aware that as Peter Mandel said, the construction of a statue is in itself an act of rewriting. They're aware that Edward Colston was put up in the 1890s, and his history, the statue really spoke of the long dominance of the merchant elite and the high church Tories over Bristol. They're aware of that, but they don't care whether the history is true, but they care whether it's useful. And they also, I think, see an opportunity to convince lots of people that Black people and brown people wanting their stories incorporated into the mainstream history is a threat to them. And there are lots of people in Britain who regard the presence, for example, of Afro-Romans in the British province of the Roman province of Britannia somehow as a threat to their history. There are people who, when you talk about slavery, will contort themselves into any intellectual position to relativize it away or push it away or pretend it didn't happen or talk about African slave traders or distract with the Barbary slave trade or whatever it takes to keep it away, to keep it out of the mainstream of British history. And I think those people who've convinced themselves and who've been encouraged to believe this by newspapers and by politicians, that their identity is under attack, I think there is a powerful attempt to use these appeals, these earnest appeals for a history that represents everyone, and to just characterize it as an attempt to take your history away from you by rewriting it. And I think we're in an incredibly dangerous position. I think history has never been as political as it is now. It's never been on the front lines. And I think while many of us might have seen the events of this summer as an incredible event, I think there were other people who saw this as an incredible political opportunity to take this movement, to make it toxic and make it seem threatening, that this is about replacing and destroying rather than augmenting and including. And I'm not quite sure how we react. One of my worries is that our obsession with the idea that what matters with history is truth is something they would see as an ancillary and naive obsession. I'm always, whenever I get dragged into these debates, I always say, well, I'm not on anyone's side, I'm on the side of history. And history is difficult. Some of it's ugly, some of it's really complicated, and it's almost never simple. It's almost never binary. It's almost never what you want it to be. And that belief in verifiable, objective fact, that we can only know what the documents tell us, that if the documents tell us the opposite of what we think, then we have to reimagine and rewrite what we think. All of that, I think, is potentially dangerous, because we're dealing with people who want historical myth. They want a distorted history, and they want to use it for political and electoral gain. So I'm more negative and more nervous after this summer, even though I'm immensely energized and inspired by this summer. I'm more frightened when it comes to anything to do with the government and history than I ever have been. Where I see there's been amazing progress in 2020 is companies and institutions. I think they are partly looking at the demographic projections. They're partly full of decent people who want to be on the right side of history, who've come to see in a new way that they never have before that racial hierarchies and white supremacy and the legacies of empire are imprinted in their mindset and the cultures of their institutions, and they really want to affect change. But when it comes to government, I think what they see as an opportunity, and they see history as a powerful way of driving a wedge between groups of people to create electoral coalitions that are at the roots of power. And I think historians are being history is being weaponized, and historians are pawns in this game. For the first time this summer, I found myself just absolutely refusing to take part in discussion programs, because you can see people dancing to the tune of those who have designed these culture wars. And I refuse to be a pawn in the game. It doesn't make any difference. And they write what they want to write about me. I mean, I've literally said, here's an example. I'm not saying X. I'm using it to say Y. And somebody's taken what I've said out of context, put it in the newspaper. So it's me wasting my time. It's sort of a willful refusal to be a pawn in their game when I end up one anyway. But I think we need to be absolutely cognizant of the way in which these ideas are being misrepresented deliberately to weaponize history and to use it as an arsenal of dangerous misinformation in a culture war that's actually about electoral politics.
Those are really sobering thoughts, David. There's a lot to think about here. It's really, on the one hand, as you said, we were all so much energized by what happened over summer, but also in addition to what you've said, drawing on your personal experiences, there are recently developments in the parliament and some speeches made recently, which maybe you're aware of, which has been very critical of critical race theory. Does send that kind of an establishment kind of born message, which is coming down from the establishment, which is perhaps expressing a certain kind of pushback to the kind of ideologies and movements that we are talking about, which is the subject matter of today. However, I think if there can be a slither of light amidst the gloominess is what's going on at the universities, and what's going on with the decolonizing of the curriculum. And in all our efforts, and that have taken place not just over the summer, of course, but over a longer period of time, even within the discipline as a whole, the Royal Historical Society has published its equality report, and they're acting on that. So there's a lot of good intention all around within the discipline, and within universities as a whole. And maybe we should at least soldier on within the domains that are left to us, and the establishment, whether or not the establishment bends. We're like, what Newton had said, we are picking up pebbles at the beach. So, we continue to pick pebbles on the beach, maybe not in a scientific enterprise kind of way, but in doing the things that we have to do.
I think you're entirely right about that. And I think we need to continue doing what we're doing, but we need to do it with an eye to the way in which it is being weaponized and mischaracterized. I think we also need to think about how the language that's come out of various forms of critical theory has fundamental weaknesses in it. It is absolutely an observational fact that a racialized society that gives advantages to some and puts some in a disadvantage creates privilege. But the phrase white privilege is being weaponized against us, like the phrase Black Lives Matter. There were weaknesses in that language. Now, it could well be the case that any phrase exactly that was used would be distorted in such a way. But I don't think when we think about these terms, we imagine them in a tabloid newspaper. And decolonizing the curriculum, we know what it means, but it's very easy to mischaracterize it, and it's being mischaracterized. The very simple and obvious and it's a materially right thing to do, that what we teach at universities in a society that's 14% non-white should reflect the society, the cultural achievements, should reflect the histories of everybody, should examine the ways in which assumptions born of empire, born of racism, are unquestioned and there within the structures of organizations, within the structures of what we teach, within what we choose to teach. That's all really obvious, but within that phrase, which means something and makes sense within academic circles, in the hands of a newspaper journalist, these phrases are in some ways the best weapons we could have given them. And so I'm critical of critical theory, because it's, despite being built on an analysis of language, it gives linguistic weapons to those opposed to it so easily and so readily. I often think what the critical theory needs is a sort of, you know, is a marketing team, because it's, the phrase white privilege is being so effectively used to undermine the objectives that people interested in race and racial justice are seeking to achieve in society. And that's just the way it is. It's not that I don't disbelieve in it, I don't get it, I totally get it, but the phrase is so dangerous. And you know, it pains me to say this, but just look at the past few days, look at how it's been weaponized, look how many times it's been used. It's quite clearly on the briefings of politicians, it's quite clearly on the briefings of journalists, that this is a wedge, that this works in the focus groups, that the algorithms tell them that this works. We gave them that weapon. So I am buoyed up and energized by a lot of things this summer, but I'm very, very frightened about the way the history has been pushed to the front line, out of its own control. It can't really change what we do. We've got to still keep doing these processes, but everything we do has to be aware that it will be and can be and will and just is going to be distorted and misrepresented.
Yeah, true. We need marketing managers. Okay, at this point, I think I would like to hand over to Hannah, and Hannah has a few questions for you, David.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like you might have answered this one a little bit already. So obviously, yeah, this past year we've seen such progress in terms of decolonising the curriculum. Even recently, I think City Hall and the organisation, the Black Curriculum, they formed a partnership to improve teaching of Black history in London schools, which is amazing. And obviously the curriculum as it stands is just completely whitewashed. So there does need to be change. But I was hoping you'd be able to kind of shed light on what decolonising the curriculum actually means. Like, what would a decolonised curriculum look like, and how would this differ from just like a diversified curriculum?
To me, there's two sorts of history that aren't told. One is a form of history that is relatively harmless, and that there is a chance of getting political acquiescence on, and the other is one that they will strongly resist. The form of history that the Prime Minister talked about at the beginning of Black History Month it's built on one word: contribution. It's about the stories of Black people in Britain who were first, who were in the armed forces, who were doctors or nurses or headmistresses. That form of history is relatively harmless. It can be presented as a celebration of immigration and what immigration's brought to the country. And it's a form of Black history that actually has been the dominant form of Black history from those who've been asking for it. So it seems like a great concession. The government saying, celebrating Black History Month the way that it celebrates Pride. Though I have to say that under the current Prime Minister, last year was one of the first years there has not been gatherings in Downing Street on Black History Month. So obviously for this year, for obvious reasons, there aren't. But last year was the first year pre-COVID that there wasn't. The form of Black history I don't think we're going to see, because I don't think the government wants to concede on it, and I don't think any government would concede on it at the moment, because it would be weaponized against them by the press. Remember, 3/4 of the press is owned by 5 billionaires. Is the form of history that puts the empire and the stories of Black and brown people back into mainstream British history. That history that shows the fundamental imperial dimensions of British history is going to be resisted enormously, because it's about bringing stuff here, because we have a mental firewall in this country. What happens over there, what happened in the empire, somehow doesn't count. That's our mindset. That British history is only really what happens within these islands. And no matter that the people doing the stuff in the empire are British, and they're doing it in the name of Britain, and they're doing it in colonies that are legally part of the British Empire, and that the profits and the raw materials from that empire come back to Britain, it somehow intellectually doesn't count. And you can see this in one really interesting place. The story that's the historical phenomena that gets people most annoyed, that will elicit the most aggression on social media, the most pushback in newspaper comments, is to talk about the fact that we know that there were at the very least hundreds, probably thousands of enslaved black children in Britain from the 17th to the 18th centuries. We know about them because they're in paintings, they're in Hogarth, they're in dozens and dozens of portraits scattered across the country. And we know about them because Glasgow University has been doing that project using digitized newspapers to find the advertisements, not just for the sale of black people in Britain, in streets, in pubs, beside the ports, but also for the adverts for the rewards for runaway black Britons. Despite that, I think it's between 800 and 900 of these advertisements now, despite being able to see these black figures in Hogarth's paintings, there is huge resistance to the idea that people lived in forms of enslavement in Britain, because it breaks that fourth wall. It shows something that we know is wrong, we know is appalling, we know Britain was responsible for taking place within Britain, and that just, in that mindset, makes it real, and it makes it a problem. So people who will acknowledge the brutality of Barbados and Jamaica in the 17th, 18th century will do anything to deny the fact that there were boys and girls, children, with slave collars on in Bristol and Glasgow and Liverpool and London in the 18th century, because it breaks the fourth wall. So that form of history that brings that history home, that shows that you can't talk about the Industrial Revolution without talking about the 80,000 plantations in the Deep South and the 1.8 million African Americans working on them, producing 97% of the cotton that was landed in Liverpool in the 1850s, that the Industrial Revolution is a story of slavery. That they'd much rather talk about Mary Seacole. They'd much rather put black heroes and black firsts and black contributions into the website, because it's harmless. It's relatively harmless because it doesn't do that fundamental thing that we need to do, which is to make what happened there relevant to what happened here, to break the fourth wall between imperial history and so-called British history. And that's where the resistance is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's funny because it wasn't until I got to university that I even sort of delved into colonial history. And actually, I saw a report released today by the University of Manchester that looks at the attainment gap between BAME students and white students. And it's just crazy. And it makes you think, if we had a decolonised curriculum, if we told the histories of, you know, so many students and people within the UK, within Britain, how different that data could look. And how
in the city whose nickname was Cottonopolis.
Exactly, yeah.
And if any city was built from this history, you know, I'm sitting from Bristol, a city built on the slave trade and sugar, talking to you in a city built on the cotton trade and slavery in the Deep South. And we're having to argue for these fundamental realities to even be taught to schools in a country that's 14% BAME, projected to be getting on for 30% BAME later this century. And these basic truths are contested. We are fighting for something so basic, just an honest telling of our history without these omissions. And our history, the history we've created, because it's full of holes, is fragile. All falsehoods are fragile. And so the defense, because this is like a sort of vase, the ring of defenses around it, I think, is becoming more and more muscular, because they understand its essential fragility. Yeah,
for sure. And yeah, just on that, as I'm in Dorset at the moment, and our MP, Richard Drax, he owns an estate that was completely, his family derived all their wealth from the slave trade.
I've been to Drax Hall. The name Drax is all over Barbados.
So I guess, like, going off that, then maybe on a slightly more inspirational note,
I'll do my best.
Obviously it's been Black History Month, and at my job I've been compiling loads of resources about Black British history just to like, yeah, raise awareness and educate some people. I came across this website called 100 Great Black Britons. I'm not sure, yeah, I think you're aware of it. And I saw that you appear on this list alongside Diane Abbott and Akala and Robert Wedderburn, who actually happens to be an ancestor of mine, which I didn't know.
Ah, really? Wow.
Yeah, he's like 8 generations back, which I only found out this summer, so that's pretty cool. So yeah, to me and like so many other students, and especially students of colour, you're such an inspiration. I feel like your book and Peter Fryer's book really changed a lot for me. So obviously there's so much value in studying history, especially I know that I often get asked though, like what is the point? Because obviously anything that's kind of arts based, especially with the current government, is sort of, you kind of swayed away from it. And I know that students of colour often feel the cultural pressures to not pursue a career in history, or like even an education that sort of centres itself in the arts. So do you have any words of wisdom about why history is so important, and why maybe for historians of colour, how like we should navigate these expectations?
I mean, to me, history was a place to look for the answers to questions, and those questions took me to needing to understand the most potent, awful, toxic, powerful idea ever created, which is the idea of race. Mm. When I was a teenager, racial violence was a fundamental part of my life. My family were driven out of our home when I was 14 years old. And although I couldn't articulate this at the time, what I went to history looking for, and the place that, you know, history does have answers, I wanted to understand why it was that people not much older than me, from the town I was from, who went to the shops I went to, who supported the football team I support to, who watched the TV programs that I watched, why they felt it was the right thing to do to go out in the middle of the night with a bag full of bricks and throw those bricks through the glass windows into the rooms in which children were sleeping, me and my siblings. It takes a very, very powerful idea to convince you that that is the right thing to do. I cannot imagine any idea that would convince me that I'd want to throw a brick through a glass window into a room in which a child was sleeping. And yet people I lived alongside decided that that was the right thing to do. And they did it repeatedly, to the extent that me and my family were forced into emergency housing. And where else are you going to find answers for that question other than the past? Because, you know, as James Baldwin said, you know, the people live in the past and the past lives in us. That idea that that was the right thing to do was born of centuries of the construction of an idea of race and racial hierarchies of inferiority and superiority. And it acts through people. We're not capable of always analyzing all of our emotions. This is why we talk about subconscious bias. This is why, since Freud, we've understood that we are not the authors of all our thoughts and the captains of all our actions. We act in ways that are influenced by the society around us, and only the most crazed libertarians don't believe that's true. We need to not believe it. They have to discount everything we know about brain science. To understand how these ideas operate, you need to actually understand what these ideas were. And history does have answers. So I needed to understand why people thought these were the right things to do, why these things were done to me and my family. And people, one of the classic ways of shutting down Black people is to say that they're bitter. I feel I've been one of the most fortunate lives I could possibly imagine. I'm not bitter. I've had difficult experiences, but so have many people. And compared to many people I know, my experiences of British racism are mild. But I still want answers. I still want to understand it. I'm not so scarred by these things that I can't think rationally. I want to understand where these ideas came from. And history, as I said, can give you answers to questions. This idea is absolutely fundamental to the way our society works. The men who designed it have been in their graves for 2 centuries. But one of the reasons why I've criticized terminology, one piece of terminology I won't criticize, is structural racism. And what I think historians, you know, can appreciate about there's that phrase is, of course, racism is structural because it was constructed. And we need to understand how an idea was built, because our attempts to deconstruct it over recent decades have not worked. And our new idea, and if 2020 is a chapter turn, the new, more active, more proactive ways of confronting race, they're still predicated on the need to understand where it came from, to understand, to dismantle something, you would want to go to the blueprints. you were tasked with dismantling a bridge, you'd want to go to the archives and find the blueprints. That's kind of where we are with the race idea. We need to understand how this was built, because it falls to our generations, and particularly your generation, to deconstruct it.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting as well. So I went to a Black Lives Matter protest earlier this year and had a quite provocative sign saying Britain created racism, which caused a lot of debate on my Facebook page, especially my old history teacher at sixth form, who is white, and he started, saying, well, what about this? What about that? And like, all this like whataboutery, which I feel like is so, whenever you talk about race or racism or like structural racism, people just want to come back with you with like,
yeah, it's a way of silencing Black people.
Yeah.
Everything is about, these things exist to silence Black people. These are all, there is never a time when it is appropriate for Black people to talk about racism or their history. There's always, we should be talking about contemporary people trafficking. We should be talking about the Barbary slave trade. We should be talking about the African slave trading kings. There's always something it never comes to the top of the to-do list. Yeah,
it's interesting as well, just from what you said earlier about bringing the kind of international British history into our borders. So yeah, thank you. That was really, really interesting.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move over to Xavier. Xavier, you've collated some questions for us, and would you like to now present them to David?
Yes. Yeah, so we got quite a few questions. So I'm just going to go through them. I'm not going to be able to ask everyone's question individually because there was quite a bit of overlap in the questions that was asked. But a lot of people, quite a few people sent questions in specifically about the Black Lives Matter movement, but more specifically about what they can do or what can be done to keep the movement going or to support the movement. And specifically as history students, what do you think people can do to support the movement?
This is going to sound flippant. I think we need to take 2 weeks off. Take 2 weeks off, rest. Because on the 4th of November, we're going to wake up into one world or another. And at that point, the demand on our energies and our resilience could be greater than we've ever experienced before. And it sounds flippant, but I genuinely mean it. We should be resting and waiting and seeing what happens, because there are scenarios, there are permutations of what might happen in America on the 3rd, and the world we wake up until the 3rd, on the 4th, that are terrifying. And we need to be ready for it. I know what I'd like to think is going to happen. I'd like to think that we'll wake up at the end of 4 years of a nightmare in which the most powerful man in the world cannot bring himself to condemn white supremacists. I hope that's the case, but it might not be the case, and we might not get a clean, neat end of anything. And I think in some ways that's the most likely scenario. I think we're going to need all our energies, because in some ways the story of 2020 is being written by us as we go along. But I think in some ways the sort of the terrible kind of worst, dark penultimate chapter, we're 2 weeks away from that. We'll know what 2020 meant. We'll have a much clearer idea about what it meant when we wake up on the 4th. So yeah, I mean, get some rest, read some books. Sorry to sound flippant, but I mean, this is the biggest election. This is the biggest election since the. I think it's definitely in our lifetime. I keep thinking about other elections in American history, and I think actually no, it's more important than that. So
yeah.
Since 1860s would be my guess.
Okay, so something that was my interest as well that I wanted to ask, but we also got a question from Susanna. She asked about, wait, sorry, one sec. Oh, sorry, no, from Zara. She asked, do you have any advice for people that want to get into making history documentaries and people that want to tell more diverse stories?
Yeah, now's the best possible time. My industry has utterly failed. And there have been commitments, there have been discussions, there have been initiatives launched this year of a different order to any that I've ever seen. I gave a speech earlier this year about television and its failings when it comes to diversity. And that was the right thing to do, in my view, to really talk about my own experiences and those of my generation. But I have to admit that the changes that are being made by the current leadership in television, the commitments to diversity, are of a different order to any I've known before. Now is a brilliant time to be getting yourself known to TV production companies. I mean, the old thing about television is that I think we have a broadcaster focus because we watch things on channels, or we used to watch things on channels. We think the broadcasters are the place to go. Most people employed in television are employed in the independent production sector, and they have an organization called PACT. And they have a list of production companies, and that's the first place to go. But the other thing is, every program you like, at the end of it, the boring bit that everyone's turned off is the bit people in television watch. We watch who made it and what the company was. You know, find a list of the names of the companies who made the programs that you like, and send them letters and nag them. And remember that they're crazy busy. They're trying to work out how to survive COVID, but they're also trying to work out how to make programs by broadcasters who are saying, if your production is not diverse, it ain't going to get a commission. I've never known changes and commitments like this to changing the story. And my God, the story needs to change, because we had figures this week that 2% of television, remember most TV is still made in London, 2% of TV is made by Black directors. The workforce of London is 36.6% Black. Historic failures, failed initiatives, half-hearted initiatives, deep cultural bias, and a informal recruitment system that means that people from the same schools and the same universities recruit each other in their own likeness. That has led us to this point where we've utterly failed. And TV is now wishing that 15, 20, 25 years ago, it had actually made these commitments. The fact that we have anybody, that we have Steve McQueen making Small Axe, which is awesome, by the way. It's my chance. I interviewed Steve McQueen earlier this week, and he was in a remedial class at school. You know, the fact that Steve McQueen is the person he is because it's down to him, not the education system, not the film industry. It's despite the film industry, despite the British education system, that we got Steve McQueen. And we need 10 Steve McQueens. And we haven't got them because TV's failed. And TV now, for the first time, knows it's failed. And film knows it's failed. So now is the time to go and demand to be the answer to their problem.
Okay. We got another question from Sophie. She asked, what inspired a house through time?
Not me, sadly. It was a sort of brilliant idea by a woman called Emma Willis, and I was approached by it. They didn't actually realize I had a master's degree in urban history. All I can really talk about creatively is what I've brought to it is I changed the format quite a lot, because I didn't think it would work unless I really, really cared about the people. And so I do lots of kind of weird, mysticky nonsense where I sort of spend a lot of time in the house thinking about these people as real people. In the first series, without telling the producers so they didn't think I was weird, I went to the graves of one of the couples and left them flowers on their graves and spent 10 minutes talking to them. Because if I just don't see how I can ask people to watch 4 hours of television about people they've never heard of in a house in a city they've never lived in, unless I really care. And also I kind of think, if you don't care about, history is about people, and if you don't care about people, I don't kind of see why you're doing history. If you don't remember, if you don't realize it, it all comes back to that kind of great Trevelyan phrase, you know, the quasi-miraculous fact of history is that people just as actual as we are used to walk these streets. That the people, you know, the buildings that you walk through in Manchester were built by people who are no longer with us. The streets were laid out, and people walked in those streets, and they had their first kiss in those streets, and they walked home drunk in those streets, and they knew the spaces that you knew. Every dimension is the same other than the dimension of time. If that's not magical, I don't understand why you're doing history. So my job is to make people who didn't study history and you know, who could be watching, you know, something on ITV, really, really care about these ordinary people living in an ordinary house. And if I don't care, I've got no business asking them to care. So I do all sort of mysticky crap and get laughed at, and try to feel, you know, well, I find it easy to feel emotion about these people. And if you can't feel emotion about somebody's life, especially a tragic life, when you're in their house, when you're in the room where these things happened, then again, I don't see why, go and be an accountant. So an insult to accountants. My father was an accountant, so I'm allowed to insult accountants.
I was actually, because I was speaking to the dad of my friend about you, coincidentally, and he was saying that he doesn't really like history documentaries generally, but it's something about you and the way that you make history documentaries that make them really, really captivating. Is that sort of what you're talking about there?
I think you have to care, and I think people know if you don't care. Also, this is this is an incredible job. If all that's asked for you is that you kind of do this amazing job and you just have to care, and you spent your life doing history, then it just seems such a small ask. And so I think about these people, and I do with everything that I do. It all comes back, as I said, to that Trevelyan quote. Look it up. There's a famous Trevelyan quote about the quasi-miraculous fact of history. It's magical. They're just like us, and they're no longer with us. But they left their imprint in all sorts of ways. They left enough to speak to us. And you can commune with the dead, and you can feel something of what they felt. And that's the reason to spend your life in archives and boring your friends in the pub about stuff they don't care about. That's the reason to be an historian, because we get to talk to people who no one else gets to talk to. We get to feel what they felt and see what they saw.
Okay.
It would have to be your very last question, Xavier, because we've got to wrap up now.
Okay. Well, we got a couple of questions in the chat, and one question sent to me as well by Maxwell. He asked, where do you stand on reparations?
I'll do that really, really quickly. Reparations are normal. End of the First World War, Germany paid reparations to France. End of the Second World War, they paid them to Israel. 1820s, the French went back to Haiti and demanded reparations from the people of Haiti. Reparations are a normal part of history. They're a normal part of international relations. They only seem to become controversial when the recipients are Black.
I think there could be no kind of decisive answer to that. That could be better than what David has just said. So I think I'll have to stop taking questions at this point because we have to wrap up. But thank you very much to David for this absolutely scintillating discussion. I mean, there's a lot of stuff to take away from what you said, some very serious and sobering, but some also very optimistic. So, there are paths closing down in certain areas, but paths also opening up. And, the commercial sector, creative industries have shown that, there are other ways of reaching out to the world than through establishment. And perhaps those are the pathways to seize. And, and that's where even history as a discipline can contribute, if not within the walls of the establishment, as it were. So I'm really grateful to you, David, for giving us your time, and the history department particularly benefits very much from your presence amongst us, and you are such a great inspiration to our students. And I hope you continue to inspire the students of Manchester and elsewhere. But there's also a wider audience out there today who've been listening to you, and I'm sure they feel inspired as well. Thanks also to Hannah and Xavier for being here with us today, for taking the questions, for asking the questions. And it's really your generations that, David speaks to. You're the ones who will have to carry on his work. So it's great that you could be part of this conversation. So thank you all very much for coming, and a very good evening to you all.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.